folks, Dr. Robert Barrington here with some more nutrition advice. I wanted to do a more general video today on nutrition as a whole, but I did want to focus on the typical Western diet. Now, the reason I wanted to do this is because I feel that even those people that are convinced that good nutrition can help their health, and even those people that make dietary changes, they find it very difficult to abandon the typical Western diet. And this is partly because people that live in developing countries have grown up with the typical Western diet. It's the only diet they know. And partly because it's a very palatable diet, and this is why it has become so rapidly accepted in many countries around the world. Food manufacturers know very well what to put in foods in order to be able to make them very palatable and make people want to eat them. And it's actually very difficult to actually completely abandon the typical Western diet. So first of all, what is the typical Western diet? The typical Western diet it's not really a single diet, but it's a group of diets that are eaten by people that generally live in Western countries. So we're talking about developed countries of the West. So we're talking about North America, including Canada and the United States. We're talking about most of Western Europe, including the United Kingdom. We're talking about Australasia, so that's Australia and New Zealand. And there are other parts around the world as well that have adopted the Western diet, but those are the main countries that really we're talking about. The Western diet is really the diet that they eat, and if we look at what it contains, it's obviously it's slightly different between the countries, but there are some generalizations that we can make. Firstly, there's high amounts of refined carbohydrates, so the starches that are in the diet, so the cereal grains, for example, they're refined. They've had the fiber and the micronutrients removed, and what's left is really just starch. There's nothing else left in the carbohydrate. In addition, there is high amounts of sugar, which are also refined. So the carbohydrate content of the Western diet is really refined starch and sugar. That's if we compare that to traditional diets that tend to eat carbohydrate, they tend to eat whole grains. So they consume the cereal grains or their sources of starch with the fiber and the micronutrients still in place, and the amount of sugar that is in traditional diets is quite limited, because you require industrialization and mechanization in order to be able to produce large volumes of refined sugar. So from traditional diets, it just really wasn't present in large amounts. What else is present in the Western diet? There's quite high amounts of animal protein, and with animal protein tends to come animal fat. And that animal fat, because these animals have been reared in conventional agriculture, they tend to be part of the agricultural industry. Those animals have large amounts of saturated fat in the fat associated with the protein. So there's quite large amounts of saturated fat, and in that saturated fat there are usually quite high residues of drugs and other toxins that are present, that are given to the animals both directly and through their feed, in order to be able to try and keep them healthy. That's in contrast to the types of animal meat that would be eaten in traditional diets, where usually it'll be wild animals that are hunted and consumed. And because they're wild, they're consuming a more varied diet. They tend to eat healthier foods. They're not exposed to drugs, and therefore their meat is of a different quality. But more importantly, the fat associated with that meat tends to be more unsaturated. It tends to contain higher amounts of essential fatty acids. So that it's not just that there is high amounts of animal protein and animal fat. It's that animal protein and fat has come from a particular type of animal, and it's not the same as would be present in a traditional diet. There also tends to be low amounts of fish in the Western diet. Fish is something that's not often consumed, whereas in contrast, if we look at, say, the Mediterranean diet, the protein is really based largely around fish. It's one of the main foods. Now, the Western diet contains high amounts of saturated fat, high amounts of refined carbohydrates, high amounts of sugar, but it's really what's also missing from the Western diet that is also concerning. The Western diet is very devoid in omega-3 fats. Omega-3 fats can be supplied from either vegetables, They can be supplied from, for example, nuts and seeds, or they could come from very small amounts in things like spinach and green leafy vegetables, or they could also come from fish, and those are the types of foods that are not consumed in the typical Western diet. So there's low amounts of omega-3 fats. In contrast, there are high amounts of omega-6 fats. Now, the omega-6 fats are present in vegetable oils. Now, vegetable oils are widely used in processed foods. They're widely added to most foods that you will find that have been processed, and they are the predominant cooking fat in the Western diet. So we've got sunflower oil, rapeseed oil, all of the oils that you see on the supermarket shelf. Those are the types of oils that contain lots of omega-6 fatty acids, and they are high in our foods. In addition, when we do have unsaturated fats in our animal fats, what we tend to find is that they're not of the omega-3 variety, they're actually of the omega-6 variety. So all of the unsaturated fat that tends to be found in our foods naturally, in our for example associated with our animal protein, that is also omega-6 fat, and the reason for that is because it comes through the feed of the animals, and therefore it accumulates in their tissues, and then when we eat the animals, it accumulates in our tissues. Now, therefore, we really have a deficiency of omega-3 fats and too many, and then a surplus of omega-6 fats in the Western diet, and this causes an imbalance. There is a requirement for about 1 gram of omega-3 fats for every 3 grams of omega-6 fats. What we find in the Western diet is there's actually probably somewhere around 1 gram of omega-3 fats for every 20 grams of omega-6 fats. So too many omega-6 fats, too few omega-3 fats, and this can obviously cause health effects. There's also a deficiency in the Western diet of vitamins and minerals. This is partly because we eat refined grains. The refined grains have their bran and germ layers removed, and these are the layers that contain in the plants, in the cereal grain, most of the micronutrients. So the fibre is moved, and so are the micronutrients. In addition to that, the general low quality of the food, the processing within the food, every time you heat food or you process it or you do something to it, you run the risk of removing some of the micronutrients, removing some of the phytochemicals, because these chemicals, a lot of them are sensitive to chemical change, and they start to degrade over time. So something that's been processed, something that's been heated, something that's been left on the shelf for a long period of time is very unlikely to have high amounts of particularly vitamins and phytochemicals. The mineral content can't really change because they're inorganic compounds, but certainly the vitamins and the phytochemical content will go down. On top of that, the Western diet doesn't really contain high amounts of plant foods. If you go into a pub on a Saturday afternoon and you look at what people are eating, they will generally have a slab of meat on their plate, or maybe some fish. That fish will be usually covered in something that is then soaked in fat. Next to the meat will be a large amount of fried potato in the form of chips. And in addition, there will be, perhaps other foods on that plate that are very high in energy, very high in fat. But there is always some green there, but it's also such a very small amount of the plate. And this is really a reflection of how our diets as a whole in the West are constructed. There's far too much energy, there's far too much protein, there's far too much animal fat and refined grains, and there's not enough plant foods. And these green plants that we should be eating, they grow everywhere. They're very cheap, they're very good for you. They're almost given away in supermarkets because they're so readily available. They really can improve your health, and in the Western diet we just don't eat enough of them. And this is problematic because they contain important phytochemicals that are antioxidants. And those antioxidants go a long way to providing the antioxidant defenses of our cells against the free radicals that we're exposed to. And what we effectively have in the Western diet is high amounts of saturated fat, high amounts of sugar, high amounts of refined grains, low amounts of vitamins and minerals, low amounts of antioxidants, low amounts of other phytochemicals. We have too much omega-6 fat, we have too little omega-3 fat, and really this is the perfect storm for ill health. We go through our lives eating this diet, and it's no surprise that the diseases that are associated with living in the developed world, the Western diseases, have all been linked to consumption of this diet. There is a very strong link between the consumption of the typical Western diet and the development of all of the typical Western lifestyle diseases, including obesity, metabolic syndrome, type 2 diabetes, arthritis, cardiovascular disease, cancer. These are the main not just killers. They don't just kill people, they also cause severe morbidity. They cause people to have a lot of pain over a long period of time, cause chronic pain. Then on top of that, you have the mental illnesses that can develop from the typical Western diet. What mental illnesses have been associated with consuming this diet? Well, you've got depression, anxiety, dementia, Alzheimer's disease. These links are becoming clearer and clearer, and if you want to protect yourself from those diseases, I would strongly recommend that you have a look at your diet and you try and remove the problem, which is the consumption of the typical Western diet. Now, I'm not going to say that consuming a plate of chips is going to do an individual long-term damage. What I'm talking about is consuming this diet over decades. This is what causes the problem. It's very easy to just go out and see how many people are overweight. That is a symptom of consuming the typical Western diet. Over time, you don't need too long to consume this diet before you start gaining weight. Bear in mind that when you're young, you can really eat, because you burn a lot of energy, your metabolism is very quick. You can usually eat the Western diet and actually get away with it. But when you get to the end of your 20s, you start to get into your 30s, this is when people start to get their middle age spread. They start to put weight on, and this is really a direct reflection of the diet they're eating. And it's that weight gain that leads to other diseases. That's an outward manifestation of really what your inner tissues are looking like. You're gaining weight and those tissues are starting to break down, they're starting to become problematic, and this is where genetic susceptibility to different diseases comes in. Some people may, for example, if they're susceptible to it, they consume the Western diet, they may develop obesity and cardiovascular disease. Somebody else eating the same diet may have more of a genetic susceptibility to obesity and type 2 diabetes. The disease you get is quite likely linked to your genetics, but ultimately if you consume the typical Western diet, you'll ultimately get a typical Western disease. The association is becoming clearer and clearer, and therefore I'm really strongly recommending that people abandon this diet. Now, if you consume a typical Western diet, can you decrease the damage that it does by consuming supplements? Possibly, but I don't think it would be enough. Many people do consume a typical Western diet, but they do make minor changes and then take supplements. I think it would be beneficial, but I don't think that would be enough to maintain what I would call optimal health, optimal physical and mental health. I think really the only way you can obtain that type of health is through totally abandoning the diet. I don't think there are any components of it really that are worth keeping and considering as being beneficial. Adopting something like a Mediterranean diet or one of the other traditional diets, or consuming whole grains, making your own diet up based on those traditional diets, but consuming foods that are of high quality, so not refined carbohydrates but whole grains. So make sure that you have your correct omega-3 to omega-6 ratio, however you want to do that. Make sure you have enough micronutrients in your diet. That might involve supplementation. It might mean that you don't need supplementation. That's for the individual to decide. Make sure that your protein comes from high quality sources and it's not associated with animal fats that have been adulterated by drugs and toxins. Make sure that your animal fats are of hopefully of organic and grass-fed origin, so that the fatty acid ratio within those fats is more closely related to what we traditionally should be eating from wild animals. And then avoid processed foods, avoid things that have been left on the shelf for a long period of time. If you go by the old adage that you should eat things that go off and eat them before they do go off, that's not actually, when you apply it to most foods, not actually a bad single rule to follow. It automatically eliminates pretty much everything in the Western diet. Just following that simple rule will mean that you would have to eat things like fruits and vegetables. It would also at the same time eliminate nearly all of the processed foods that are causing these problems. So the Western diet is a big problem, and I think people need to really take responsibility for their health and have a good look at what their diet is actually doing to them. One last thing I'd like to say is, if you have been consuming a typical Western diet all of your life and you've never consumed a different diet, I would suggest you've never known what it's like to have optimal health. So those people that do clean up their diet, those people that do eat a healthy diet and have previously eaten a typical Western diet, most of the people I've talked to have talked about this complete change, a complete physical change in their energy levels, a complete change in their outlook on life, a complete change in their mental capacity, their ability to remember things, their ability to think, their ability to get up early, do a day's work, and still at the end of the day have time to go training because they have the energy left. It's a really different philosophy of way of live, philosophy in your life. It changes the way you live because of the effects it has on your physiology. And if you've never felt what it's like to have that zest in life, and you want to know, I would suggest that you, if you're consuming a typical Western diet, then you actually have a look at swapping to something more like a traditional Mediterranean diet, something with high quality foods in it, and I think this will go a long way to showing you what you have been missing for all of this time. It's really very difficult to emphasize how much of a difference it makes when you do clean up your diet, and when you do hit the sweet spot of a diet that works for you. You have a very high capacity for work, and you become the human being that you should have been all along. I think there's many people in the developed countries that are almost like zombies. They're going through the motions of life, but ultimately they're not really living their life to the fullest because they don't have the physical or mental capacity to do that. So hopefully, though, this has been interesting, and I know I'm preaching to the converted in terms of most of the people who watch my videos that have already made these choices, but obviously some people do come across these videos and they're just starting out and they don't know what to do. So really this video is aimed at them. But if you have cleaned up your diet and you have experienced what it's like to live in this kind of the zone where your energy levels and your mental capacity are much elevated, really it's your duty to tell other people about the benefits, so that we can hopefully encourage people to eat more healthily and take responsibility for their own health, and I think this can only be a good thing. So if you've enjoyed this video and you found it useful, please give me a thumbs up, and if you haven't already done so, I invite you to subscribe to my channel. I've got plenty of other nutritional videos that you might find interesting. As always, eat well, stay healthy and protect yourself, and I will see you soon for another video. Take care.